Hey everyone, it's Mike from Voluntary Virtues Network. Really pleased to bring you a brand new Voluntary Virtues 3 p.m. Monday special guest series. As many of you know, VVN has a full launch scheduled the very first week of July. And I want to make sure you guys check out our sister Facebook page, which is in the description section below. We have almost 200,000 subscribers, just under 250,000 and growing. So thank you to all the people out there supporting us. We're making big waves out here in this small world, hopefully, at least relatively. Anyway, although we still are in a test month, that hasn't stopped us from bringing you guys great content with some large, big names, whatever perspective you want to take at this. But the last 2 weeks, we hosted Dr. Walter Block and Jeffrey Tucker. This week, I'm proud to announce another amazing guest, Dr. David Friedman. How are you doing, Dr. David?
Fine.
Do you want me to call you David, or I've
don't.
never actually asked you this outright. Yeah, you're pretty. What do the kids call it? Chillax. So anyway, it's for those who haven't seen our prior interviews. I want to obviously you can't do this in the live, but in the recorded section afterwards, you're going to see some annotation links. You can click on those and go check out one of the discussions I have. I even highlighted it in a separate little 5-minute piece video. Was on consequentialism versus deontology. It brought up a little utilitarianism in there as well. Other videos talking about strategy, a bunch of great past videos. But regardless of those, the viewers kept piling on question after question. I figured we'd have to have a genius like David back on the Voluntary Virtues stage. So let's just jump right into this. For most of you who haven't seen or heard of who David Friedman is before, check out one of the videos, and they obviously go in much more detail about our past. We already kind of went through that. I don't want to bore the current viewers who've been with us for a while. So let's jump right into it, David. We have a question from viewer Daniel Hawkins. He wants me to ask you how a polycentric law could satisfy both napists and apeists and the purist consequentialist, as he puts it.
I'm not sure that it can or that anything can. To begin with, different people disagree about what counts as aggression. If you think about disagreements over things like intellectual property, for example, somebody who believes, as Rand did, that intellectual property is the purest form of property will say that when I stop you from copying my book, I'm not engaged in aggression because you're violating my property rights. Someone who believes, as some libertarians do, that intellectual property is nonsense, that it's not the sort of thing that can be owned, would say I am initiating aggression. So under any system at all, there will be things happening that some libertarians think are aggression and some think are not aggression. And in a polycentric world, you're going to reduce some of those problems because in a polycentric world, not everybody is under the same law. Of course, in our system, not everybody's under the same law either, although it's a little less obvious because the legal rules that apply to you depend on what state you live in, what city you live in, and what country, and so forth. But in the polycentric system, what's happening is that individual firms that sell the service of protecting people's rights agree with each other on what private court they will use to settle disputes. Firm A and B won't necessarily agree on the same court as firm C and D. And to some degree, you will have specialization, so that you can imagine that there, example I used in Machinery of Freedom, you can imagine that there are people who live in a place where water is scarce, where water is a scarce and valuable resource. And they will want legal rules that specify in some detail who has the right to draw water from a river. As you may know, historically, there are a number of different approaches that have been used for that. Those rules would be a nuisance for people who live in places where there's lots of water, where there is no shortage. There'd just be a way in which some people could harass others. So you could imagine that the one group will try, if possible, to get their rights enforcement agencies to agree to courts that have detailed water law, the other ones that don't. Now, we can't all have the law we want, because the law between me and you is the same as the law between you and me, and we may not agree on what the law should be. But we can come closer to all having the law we want in a system where each of us is, in effect, trying to buy the law he wants, and successful only to the extent that the agencies that he's a customer of can get other agencies to agree to what he wants. So that's I guess maybe a long answer to the question, but I'm afraid the question doesn't have a simple answer.
So, okay, well, I guess one of the questions I have stemming off of this before we go into other viewer questions is, do you think a polycentric law would favor either side more, the Napist side or the consequentials? Because obviously it is taking a utilitarian perspective, at least I guess from the majority perspective. But wouldn't it also favor? You would think that almost every single law, almost every time, like I can't see. I remember you having an example once where you said the heroin wouldn't be, it might not be protected by one, resolution agency or one DRO or whatever you want to call it, but I can't see it ever being in a scenario like. Can you give us a scenario where a
Let me
positive
see if I can answer the question. I think I understand the question you're asking. Let me see if I can answer it. The system that I've described of a competing polycentric law will tend to generate what we would call economically efficient law, which is in very roughly law that maximizes the degree to which everybody gets what he wants. And that is, again, approximately utility maximizing law. Approximately because economic efficiency measures values by willingness to pay. And willingness to pay is not a perfect measure of intensity of preference because, among other things, some people have more money than others, and a variety of other reasons as well. So it would be too simple to say that that efficiency is utility maximization. It's a proxy for utility maximization, and only an approximate one. Furthermore, the polycentric system doesn't perfectly maximize economic efficiency. I have, for people who want to look at the draft chapters for the new edition of Machinery, which isn't, the edition isn't out yet, but the draft chapters are up on my website. And I have one in which I discuss what I think of as market failure on the market for law, respects in which the competition will give a less perfect law, economically speaking, than a perfectly wise dictator would give. But we have a shortage of perfectly wise, benevolent dictators. So sort of, as I say, it becomes a long answer, but what I'm basically saying is that the competitive market for law will give an approximation to efficient law, which is in turn an approximation to utility maximizing law. So it has a tendency to give the consequentialist result, but it doesn't do it perfectly. Second point is, as a general rule, freedom is utility maximizing. That as a general rule, but not necessarily always, people value the ability to violate other people's rights less than they value the ability to have their own rights protected. That's sort of at the center of why libertarians, even if they say that what matters is not violating rights, they actually believe that a society without rights violation will be a very attractive society. We believe liberty works. To the extent that liberty is economically efficient, an economically efficient legal system will in fact give you liberty. So that means that the system I've described will have a tendency to generate libertarian law. But again, I don't want to overstate it. These are not simple questions. And you can imagine some case, and the example I give is if almost everybody thinks heroin is a terrible thing and they don't want themselves and their children exposed to the temptation of knowing heroin addicts, that might mean that the value to the people who want heroin illegal is larger than the value to the ones who want it legal. And you might have a anarchist society in which I could sue you for using heroin. It's not an impossible outcome, but it's an outcome a good deal less likely than the equivalent outcome in a political system, since if everybody is against heroin, obviously the government is going to have laws against heroin, as it in fact does. And in fact, our government has laws against marijuana, even though a majority of the population think it should be legal, and I would guess a fairly small minority think it's a dreadful, threatening thing.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm arguing that the polycentric system will come closer to both rights maximizing and welfare maximizing, utility maximizing, than the government alternative, but it's not going to do a perfect job of either.
No, it makes sense not to put ratios in your own mouth, but basically an asteroid could hit the Earth tomorrow and wipe us all out, but most likely it's not going to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. So
that's quite unlikely tomorrow.
Yeah.
If it's that close, we've probably spotted it. But a year and a half from now, yes.
Yeah, right. Okay, no, I like that even better. It kind of puts more of a perspective on the ratio. So a while back, when I had you on the show, not the last show, but the show before that, we were talking about a free society and how we believed it was going to be built on a fractional reserve banking system. I agreed with you that not only on the FRB part, but also the bad part of state-run currencies are that FRB wins out in the end. There's other problems with state currencies. It's not really fractional reserve. As long as there's full disclosure and the individuals have the option of full reserve, which you would in a free market, somebody would be willing to take a full reserve. It might cost them money. But I have a viewer who wants us to go even farther. Mitchell Connor Wycheck wants me to ask you, what are your thoughts on free banking as far as how many competitors you could see opening up? Do you think it would be like one currency? Do you think that it would be maybe like 2 or 3 banks that would win out? Do you think it would be much more decentralized than that? What kind of a vision do you have for the banking system itself? If we can go a little bit more.
It's very hard to guess what an industry that doesn't exist and that hasn't existed under modern conditions would look like. That if we take the case of the Scottish free banking system, which was a system that existed when Adam Smith was writing, there were multiple banks. Their currency was exchangeable at 1-to-1 because it was all defined in silver at the same rate. I'm pretty sure that's a correct statement. So that's a possible model. You can have a system in which there are a large number of issuers, but all or almost all of them arrange the way they define their money in such a way that it exchanges at 1-to-1. I believe it's the case, if I'm not mistaken, that the Hong Kong money is technically private, although I don't think it's open entry free banking system, right, with 2 different banks. One of them is the Bank of Hong Kong in Kowloon, and I forget the name of the other. And I may be out of date, that is, I'm really describing what I remember from quite a while ago, but I think there were 2 banks that issued Hong Kong dollars, and they did it in such a way that their dollars exchanged at 1-for-1, and they in fact did it in such a way that there was a constant ratio between the Hong Kong dollar and the US dollar. Not by fiat, so to speak, but by their policies. That in effect, they had policies such that if the value of the Hong Kong dollar went above the usual ratio, they issued more Hong Kong dollars and it went down. If it went below, they pulled them in.
So they pegged it to competing fiat.
That's right. So that it really turned out that what they had was the analog of a gold system. Right. It was the analog of a gold system, only you were creating Hong Kong dollars rather than mining gold, but creating them in response to changes in their value. So it was sort of an interesting system. And I'm giving this all by memory from a long time ago, so I don't guarantee all the details are correct. But in any case, that's one possibility. Another possibility is it might turn out that with 2 or 3 of them, and with modern communications and the internet, that was enough. So I don't think and it also might turn out that you had more than one unit. It might be that there was some sizable part of the market that wanted a unit that was very stable in terms of U.S. prices. And you could certainly imagine a bank. I've discussed elsewhere the idea of a fractional reserve system where the unit is the commodity bundle, where what the issuer says is, bring me $1 million Friedman dollars, and I will give you 500 pounds of grade A steel, 500 bushels of wheat, 1 ounce of gold, a bundle of different commodities. And if you think about that, by setting the commodities, you can make that something very much like a price index. You can set it up so that if prices in the U.S. in Friedman dollars start to go up, the result is that it pays people to turn in their dollars for the commodities, at which point the money supply gets smaller and the prices go down again. So you could imagine a future where there is one group of currencies which are defined in a way that make them particularly attractive to people in the U.S. There might be another group of currencies that were defined in a way that made them particularly attractive to people in some particular industry, where what happened in that industry depended mainly on the price of oil or something. I mean, I'm guessing, because this is an industry, this doesn't exist. But you can certainly see that you might end up with several different standards, and one bunch of people who mostly used one, and one bunch used another, and some of them used both, as lots of people in Europe for quite a while before the euro came out, and even after the euro came out. You know, I've got British pounds, euros, U.S. dollars, and some Chinese money sitting in my room at the moment since I've been traveling. So I don't really want to predict with much confidence. I doubt you'd end up with a single issuer. I think people would probably prefer not to rely on a single issuer, but I think you might end up with 3 or 4 or 5. You might end up with 100, all exchanging it at 1 for 1. You might end up with several different standards and a bunch of issuers for each of them.
Interesting. No, great answer. I really do. I agree with you. I can't see anywhere that I would think you'd be wrong. So, one quick question into the present. Come back into 2014. The viewer Chuck Ford wants me to ask you: do you even use Bitcoin right now, or what do you think of Bitcoin?
I have some Bitcoin. I have mostly do not use it. The reason I have Bitcoin is that about a year ago, I was a speaker at PorcFest at the Free State Project in New Hampshire, and they agreed to pay my expenses, and I asked them to pay my expenses in Bitcoin because I thought it would be fun to have some Bitcoin. And I made money on it. I haven't checked what it is currently, but when I checked a while ago for my own curiosity, the Bitcoins that I had were worth several times what they had been worth when they paid it to me. And Bitcoins go up and down, so it's probably still true, but I'm not sure. But I have a vague feeling that I may have once done it. I have a vague feeling that I paid for something in Bitcoin once, but I'm not sure. But I don't, in fact, use Bitcoins. Mostly because one of the general problems with any new currency is that it isn't very useful until a lot of people use it. So Bitcoin's a neat idea. It's an idea that never occurred to me. I've been writing about digital currency for quite a long time, but what I was imagining was a Chaumian anonymous digital cash, which Bitcoin is not. Bitcoin, in some sense, is the least anonymous money that has ever existed, since every transaction is public information to everybody who uses Bitcoin. It's anonymous only in the sense that the information is about accounts, not about people. So that if you can't link the account to a person, you know that the account received money but not the person did. On the other hand, if you imagine someone who is seriously trying to investigate what you're doing, once they find one transaction that involved a person of a known name, they can then see what the account is that person has because they can follow that transaction. Somebody pays me a Bitcoin and watches what happens to the list of who has what Bitcoins. I now have that Bitcoin. Account X now has my Bitcoin, so account X must be my account. They can now track all payments that I make and receive by watching that account. So Bitcoin is not an anonymous currency, and there are proposals for making it anonymous, and maybe they'll work. I don't know that enough about it. Chaumian digital currency, if it existed, would be a true anonymous currency, and that's what I had imagined coming into existence. The big weakness of a Chaumian digital cash is it requires a bank. That it requires that somewhere there is a bank which is issuing it and will redeem it. Banks have to exist inside countries. Countries do not want anonymous digital cash to exist. Anonymous digital cash exists, money laundering laws become unenforceable. It becomes somewhat easier to hide income from tax collectors, so there are a variety of reasons why governments would prefer to avoid this, and therefore it's going to be difficult to bring a Chaumian digital cash into existence. And the elegant feature of Bitcoin from this standpoint is that there's no issuer. It doesn't require that there be a bank that redeem it. It's really a very different, ingenious but very different kind of concept, and we'll see how it works. I hope it works. But anyway, so yes, I have some Bitcoin, but I've made almost no use of it. And at some point, there will be something I want to buy with Bitcoin.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on the regression theorem and Bitcoin and money? Do you consider gold and silver as the real money that's been chosen over the years? I can't remember reading or seeing any videos of yours that hit on this topic. Is Bitcoin money to you? Do you consider it money?
Yeah, Bitcoin is money. You can use it to buy stuff with. Lots of things have been used as money over the years. The Romans used brass and I think maybe cattle. as money. The Icelanders used silver and wool cloth, Vathmal, as money. So, silver and gold are quite convenient monetary commodities, but their convenience doesn't matter very much anymore, because once what you're carrying is a piece of paper giving you a claim to a commodity, the fact that the commodity itself has a high value to weight ratio. Right? One of the real virtues of silver and gold currency is that you can carry a reasonable amount of purchasing power in your pocket because they have a high value to weight. But the weight of a piece of paper giving you a claim to an ounce of gold is no higher than the weight of a piece of paper giving you a claim to a ton of steel. So from that standpoint, once you move to a modern society where most of what people are using are pieces of paper representing claims to things, it isn't that important whether you have the particular characteristics that gold and silver have, which are the characteristics that made them useful currencies in the past. And there are lots of other currencies. In fact, it turns out, if you think about it, that the closest historical example of something equivalent to Bitcoin is an example that only economists know about, namely the stone money. There was an island somewhere in the Pacific, I don't remember anymore where it was, where the people used stones as money. And these were very large stones, boulders, so they weren't actually moving around. But they just kept track of who owned which stone. There were a fixed number of stones on the island, and if I wanted to buy something from you, we agreed that this stone over here that everybody knew was mine, I don't know if they had marks on it or something, now was yours. So it was a pure keeping accounts system where you had a limited supply of something, and it wasn't used at all, but people wanted it as money, and that gave it value. And that really is pretty. Bitcoin has got the mining feature as well, but leaving that aside for a moment, that Bitcoin is a system where you have a account book that tells everybody who owns which Bitcoin, and as long as Bitcoins are useful for transactions, that gives them value, and therefore it works. It's a sort of a pulling yourself up by your bootstraps kind of system, but it does function. And the stone money is an example that it could function for a long period of time in a very primitive society. And if I remember correctly, there's a story that at some point, I think there were somehow some of the stones got underwater. I think maybe they were being moved from one place to another and the ship sank or something. I don't remember the details. And the people figured that was no problem. They still knew the stones existed. They knew where they were. They couldn't get at them, but they could still keep track of who owned which stone. And so the stones that were entirely inaccessible were still part of the monetary system. Somewhere there's a famous economics article called The Island of Stone Money, which tells the whole story. I'm repeating from my memory of that story. But it's interesting in that it suggests that something very much like Bitcoin, where the thing itself has no value, except as money, but that's sufficient. The monetary demand holds up its market value, and that makes it useful as money. But in any case, we can observe that Bitcoin, if anybody really says that only gold and silver are money and Bitcoin is worthless, if he has any Bitcoins, then we should give them to me.
Yeah, shovel them on over, right? Yeah, well, I think the ledger system itself kind of fulfills the regression theorem in some aspect of it anyway. Not that you have to support the regression theorem or not, just that it does satisfy it, because it's a new thing that does advance. It's innovative, right? Like gold it didn't just come into existence one day and boom. People had to talk about it and start, understanding there was scarcity in it, and this is obviously before written time. But
if you think about a commodity money like gold or silver, part of the reason that gold was valuable was that it could be used for making pretty jewelry and for gilding things, and part of the reason was it could be used for money. So what you had was a demand which was the sum of a monetary demand and a non-monetary demand. And it was that sum demand that was determining the price and the quantity of gold. And Bitcoin is the limiting case where all of the demand is monetary demand and none of it is non-monetary. But the logic is still the same.
No, fair enough. Let's take this one last question on Bitcoin real quick, because I had a few people asking me about this. Do you consider Bitcoin property? And this really goes into IP, intellectual property.
Yeah, that is, my Bitcoins are my property, and they are my property because I can control their transfer, and they are my property in the sense that other people can't control it. So, the ultimate thing that makes things property, it seems to me, is the fact that you're able to control them. So yeah, I would say that they're property. I'm not sure I would say that they're the same thing as intellectual property because I didn't invent any of the bitcoins. But they're a very weird kind of property, but there are lots of weird kinds of property in the world.
Okay, no, fair enough. That's a fair enough answer. All right, let's see here. The next question I want to ask you about is, I think we should go with this one. Arturo Rigoroli wants me to ask you about stateless societies in general. How do you think we can actually get I've heard you talk about some strategies. I kind of want you to go over the strategies that you believe in. Maybe you've updated them since PortFest 2 years ago too. I am curious to where you stand on strategies for bringing about a stateless society. I know you're not big on changing ethics, but on changing the systems we live in.
Yeah, I think I can see several possibilities. The one I've mostly thought in terms of is a gradual evolution where private institutions replace government institutions. And some of that happens already. A lot of disputes are settled by private arbitration, not by courts. A lot of people live in proprietary communities where what's really protecting them is not the police force, but a private security guard that they're paying for, and so forth. And I think one can imagine a continuous shift as governments are seen to do a bad job of doing things, as entrepreneurs create private substitutes for things the government's not doing very well. You could certainly imagine a shift of K through 12 education, for example, almost entirely out of the public schools, happening due to the development of online education. That the situation at the moment is that the educational part of what schools do can be done in quite an adequate way online at a very close to zero cost per pupil. The babysitting part of what schools do is harder, but if you imagine that people are unsatisfied with the public schools for any variety of reasons, and that you have developed good enough online education to entirely replace the educational part, it shouldn't cost that much for someone to provide, as it were, a school without teachers, in which the adults are just making sure that the kids aren't killing each other or doing anything terribly dangerous. Essentially, a sort of a babysitting for people who are older than babies. So that would be one way in which you could imagine the public schools being replaced. To some extent, they're replaced now by homeschooling, not, I think, enough. To some extent, by private schooling. If you had a voucher system, you could pretty easily imagine a future in which almost all schooling was private but partly paid for by the government. And at that point, it becomes easier for people to imagine, well, wait a minute, I'm giving the government $5,000 in taxes, they're giving me back $4,000 to help educate my kids. Why don't we cut out the middleman and go to a fully private system? So I think there are a lot of ways in which you can imagine a gradual development in which it's not that you ever abolish government, it's just that after a while it doesn't matter. For a entertaining fictional portrayal of that, the science fiction novel Snow Crash, which is a novel in which there are still people who think they work for the government, but they aren't actually doing anything, and all of the government functions are being privately produced. I'm not sure if Stephenson, who wrote that, was familiar with the sort of libertarian and anarcho-capitalist literature, or if he was just making it up for himself, but it's quite a fun, it's a somewhat tongue-in-cheek novel, but it's quite a lot of fun, I think. So anyway, so that's one path. Second path, which has become, I think, reasonably plausible over the last couple of decades, is that you could develop a future where real space still had governments, but cyberspace had a version of anarcho-capitalism. And I've sketched out various versions of that. And it's not identical to my standard version, because my standard version of a stateless society isn't one in which you can use physical force to protect your rights, in which the rights enforcement agencies, at some point when someone steals my television, they send some big strong guys to take it back. Whereas the online version, I think, your enforcement is all by reputational mechanisms rather than by forceful mechanisms. And I've sketched in various things that you can find on my, I guess I've got one of the new chapters for machinery discusses it, and there are a number of articles you can find on my webpage in which I discuss that. So you could imagine a future where online interactions were happening in a stateless world. Especially if you develop public key encryption, if you develop the use, we already know the math, but if you could develop the use of public key encryption to the point where most people were able to interact online while keeping their real space identity secret. That's sort of the ideal of that kind of a society, what I refer to as a world of strong privacy in one of my articles. So in that world, government can't control what it can't see, and you can therefore have a world in which online interaction is free, in which you have enforcement of contracts by reputational methods, which I've discussed at some. I've got an article from Imperial China to Cyberspace, which is about contracts without state enforcement for various odd reasons, because in Imperial China it looks as though you had almost no contract law but elaborate contractual practice. So you can imagine a world where cyberspace is free, where governments still rule real space. And then there are two things that makes that closer and closer to anarcho-capitalism. One of them is that the more of your life is lived online, the more mobile you are geographically. That if most of your friendships are online, if your job is online, it doesn't cost you very much to move from the US to Canada, or even to Mexico, or to Iceland, or to Chile, or to any reasonably attractive society. And
outside government, right.
Societies with governments. That isn't my point. My point is that it means that governments more and more have to compete for taxpayers.
Gotcha.
If you have a world where it's cheap to move, now governments are getting closer and closer to being private firms competing for customers, and farther from being monopolists. All right, so that gets you to a case where the governments themselves may have a reason to steadily reduce how many bad things they do because they have to attract customers. So at the same time, if, as I think is reasonably likely, more and more life is shifting to cyberspace, if you imagine that virtual reality is getting better and better, and so most people who work are working are virtually in a business, not physically in a business, as it were. That most firms are virtual firms where the employees can be anywhere in the world, but online they're doing exactly what we're doing. They're in a Google Hangout when they're talking together, or the equivalent of it. You can then have a world where it doesn't matter very much that the 10% of your life that is happening in real space is controlled by governments, because the 90% that isn't is most of what matters. So you can imagine essentially a possible path to something like anarcho-capitalism, which involves some combination, involves first cyberspace itself being a free society, and some combination of shifting life into cyberspace and forcing governments to compete for taxpayers, because with cyberspace taxpayers are mobile. That's a second possibility. There's a third possibility that my son Patri has been pushing for some time, which is sort of an ingenious idea, and that is that if you develop a good enough technology for floating housing, what he calls seasteading, like homesteading but on the sea, that then you have the potential of polities where everybody is mobile at a low cost, where if we form our political organization, we form a town out at sea somewhere with 10,000 people on what are essentially giant rafts, and after a while we decide that half of them disagree with the other half about something, one group calls the towboats, they pull their rafts away, they find some other people who agree with them, and they join with them. And so that could give you, not my model of anarcho-capitalism, but something rather like it, in which any political institutions that exist only by unanimous assent, because anybody who doesn't like leaves.
Because you can't do that with land right now. It's not. It's a little harder to divide and move,
That's
huh?
right. And that's much workable, more workable if you have a technology where you can sort of take your house and your land with you when you move. So those are all possibilities. And I'm not in the prophecy business. I am by nature an optimist, but I'm not claiming any of these things will happen. But I think all of those are possible paths. There's a fourth path which I think is less likely and probably more dangerous, and that is if for some reason the existing system collapses, then you might be able to rebuild along something like anarcho-capitalist lines. So there are people out there, certainly including some libertarians, who think we're headed for a terrible crash where the government's going to go broke and this is going to happen, and different people have different theories. If something like that happened, and if there wasn't a foreign government in a position to seize us or take over, you could then imagine redeveloping your institutions along anarcho-capitalist lines. And I could certainly see that one could write interesting science fiction novels along those lines. But it doesn't strike me as a very, very likely possibility. And I think if you do have a collapse, you're rather more likely to develop worse systems than better systems. That unless people's ideas change a lot, most people think of government as important mainly for protecting them from murder, robbery, rape, things like that. So if you have a chaotic situation, they're likely to want more government, not less. Now there's a point which my father made a long time ago and has been misrepresented since, and that's that if you have ideas that are clearly not politically workable at present, it may still be worth putting them out, getting them into the sort of body of ideas people know about. Because if there is some future crisis where people say, look, we're desperate, we don't know what to do, then they may be willing to consider ideas that were outside of the range of political possibility. So in that sense, one reason for having people know about the idea of stateless societies and polycentric law and the rest of it is so that if things did collapse in the U.S. or somewhere else, one of the options they might consider would be along those lines. So I think all of those are possibilities, but I'm not predicting what's going to happen.
Fair enough. I have my own question. We have plenty of other viewer questions before I let you go, but I do wonder, can a free society coexist with a neighboring state?
Well, certainly relatively free societies have coexisted with neighboring states. The East Germany and West Germany coexisted for quite a long time, and West Germany was not as free as you would like, but it was an awful lot freer than East Germany was. Oddly enough, Hong Kong at present is formally a part of the People's Republic of China, and yet it is rather different from the People's Republic of China. I was just over in China and in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, very interesting trip. Now, at this point, of course, China is also a pretty free society, not as free as I'd like it to be, but compared to what it was 30 years ago, it's a free society. But when I was in China, I could not access my own blog online because China has got what they refer to as the Great Firewall of China. And I am told the people who live there have fairly easy ways of getting around it. But at least for a visitor, if you just go on the online automatically, a whole lot of things are blocked. You can't see them. They weren't blocked when I got into Hong Kong. So that was a case where even though you have the same government in theory running both of them, that government has presumably concluded that it doesn't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, that Hong Kong was a very prosperous and successful society. It provided lots of entrepreneurs and capital for developing stuff in the rest of China, and they were therefore willing to leave it as, in most respects, quite a free society, even though they were officially ruling. So I think, yeah, you can have coexistence. You can not have coexistence depending on circumstances.
Okay, good answer. Daniel Hawkins, a guy I really respect, wants me to ask you, what do you consider some of the libertarians who say that you can abolish the state forcefully or defending yourself? There's some people who call for a violent revolution. They say, look, it worked for the founding fathers for at least a short period of time. We could do it again, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's a counterproductive strategy for the reason I pointed out before, that I think that acts of violence tend to make everybody who's not committing them more inclined to believe in government, not less, because they see the government as what protects them against violence. In the case of the Founding Fathers, what they were establishing was not very different from what they started with. The government they were rebelling against was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean at a time when crossing that ocean took a lot more time and money than it does now. So I don't think that's really comparable to the case of having a revolution against the government, the local government, as it were, that's currently running things. There are circumstances in which revolutions work. Gordon Tullock, who was a friend and colleague of mine, an interesting, crazy, original guy, used to argue that all revolutions were really coups. And his argument was that the romantic picture of a revolution runs into the public good problem. That basically, if I put my neck out to try to overthrow the government, if there is a benefit, it's shared with everybody else, whereas I'm the one who bears the cost of being likely to end up dead. And that therefore what really happens is that when there's a change in government, you've got some small group of people who are in a position where they have quite a lot of power to influence things, where they can hope that after succeeding in their revolution, they'll be the ones in charge, and you therefore have a change of government in which those people may indeed get mobs of their supporters to help them. But Tullock's argument, at least, was that the sort of masses rising up and overthrowing things didn't really happen. Now, I'm not sure if he was right, but he may have been right. Anyway, I say my basic view is that shooting policemen is going to make people more willing to approve of policemen shooting other people, not less, and therefore is going to make the situation worse, not better.
Fair enough. Good answer. Arturo Rugaroli has one more question for you, too. He says, what endeavors do you believe individuals, especially entrepreneurs, should seek state permissions, and what they should do outside of state regulation? So what do you recommend people do? So in other words, what do you think an entrepreneur can do inside of the state that doesn't infringe on somebody else that they just kind of have to do? And what are some of the things that they can do kind of agorist?
Not being that sort of entrepreneur, I haven't really thought very hard about that question. My favorite line about dealing with the government is from Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where the protagonist, Manny, says, do business with the authority. Do business with the law of gravity, too. That is, the government is out there. You can't ignore the fact that it's out there. So I would say that if you want to drive a car, it is prudent to have a driver's license. That's following a government regulation. If you want to produce medical drugs and sell them on the market, you're going to have to conform with the FDA. If you want to produce illegal recreational drugs, obviously you don't have to conform to the FDA, but there are going to be hazards to doing that. You might end up in jail. In a sense, the best thing is if you can find ways of doing things outside the government system that aren't currently covered by any clearly defined regulations. So if you look at the various cell phone-enabled taxi cab substitutes, Uber, I think, is the best known of those. And that was a case where we have a niche that didn't obviously fit within the existing regulation, but undercut the existing regulatory scheme. And I have, as it happens, I have a chapter on this subject that was written more than 40 years ago. In Machinery of Freedom, I have a chapter on jitneys. Jitneys were an early 20th century equivalent of Uber, minus the cell phones, in which you have people who are driving somewhere, and they pick up riders and drop them off. They were called jitneys because jitney was slang for a nickel, and the standard fare for a jitney at the time was a nickel. But they were not buses, they were not taxi cabs, they were privately owned cars.
Lyft, huh? Lyft? You heard of Lyft, the new taxi cab service that's individual?
I don't know that one, but the basic idea is a pretty clear idea. And the point I made in that chapter was that this is a very low-cost form of mass transit because the capital structure, namely the cars and the roads, is already there. And what you're doing is simply utilizing it more efficiently. That an automobile with one person in it is a pretty costly form of transportation. An automobile with 4 people in it is a moderately efficient form of transportation. And putting 3 more people in an automobile gets you additional transport at a cost close to zero. So I was suggesting a pre-cell phone, pre-internet mechanism by which you could coordinate such a thing. But the basic idea was the same idea. They just have a better technology for it. So that's a nice example where they seem, as far as I can tell, to be reasonably successful. And of course, the taxi cab people try to get them regulated out of existence. And in some places they will succeed, and in some places they won't succeed. And I think there have got to be a fair number of other niches where somebody who's clever can find something that isn't illegal, but nonetheless undercuts the existing system. And you know, sometimes they'll succeed, sometimes they won't succeed. But that's, I think, more interesting.
A garage sale. There's one.
What?
A garage sale.
Yeah.
Unregulated oppression and exploitation, right?
Right.
Anyway. All right. No, great answer. Xavier Spade, we're going to get into take a turn into a whole other discussion right now. Xavier Spade wants me to ask you, or wants us just to discuss anarcho-communism in general. I have more of a direct question that I took from his. Do you believe that anarcho-communism is essentially a form of statism in itself? Or do you see the problem is, like, is there a difference really between, to me, it's kind of like you're just submitting yourself into like involuntary servitude almost, right? Because you have no property rights to even claim some ability to not work when people tell you not to work on their property.
I think part of the problem is what you mean by anarcho-communism. Okay. And I think that a small-scale commune can work and has worked. Mm-hmm. The Oneida commune in New York in the 19th century, I think, had something on the order of 100 or 200 people in it. And it worked for a generation. It worked basically until the founder got old. And there are surely other examples where you have a group of people who agree that they will hold their property in common. I should say the Oneida commune was also a group marriage. If you think about, we think of sort of that we're so enlightened. This was a 19th century community in which everybody was married to everybody, in which they in fact had sex with each other. The fact was known and they survived. As they eventually disappeared, but they survived for quite a long time. That there are a lot of interesting sort of experimental communities in the 19th century America. It was freer society than we often realize. So the problem that the anarcho-communism faces on any large scale is that they don't have a solution to the coordination problem. That the problem is, how do we make sure that the inputs that are needed for what I want to do are being made by you? How do I find out what people want that I'm doing, and so forth? The whole problem of coordinating a population of millions of people. And as far as I know, the only mechanism for doing that, the only class of mechanisms for doing that work tolerably well are decentralized mechanisms along the general lines of private property and trade. And there are certainly, one can imagine, different variants of that. If you think about the Yugoslav system back when Yugoslavia was nominally communist, it's not clear how communist it was, because it was a system in which firms were workers' co-ops. The firm decisions were made by the workers, not by the government authority above it. Firms could trade goods with each other. So it looks in a way like a capitalist society with rather odd incorporation rules, in which the only kind of corporation you can have is one owned by the employees. And that is, you know, less attractive than I would say, than a freer system, but it's not really communism either, because you do in fact have private property. And a system in which you're not allowed to have private property, it seems to me that a system in which some other people get to allocate you to jobs without your permission is not a free society. On the other hand, a system in which you've got a group of people who've all agreed to be part of a voluntary commune, I don't see anything particularly unfree about that. Presumably, if they don't like it, they can and will leave.
Let me ask you this while we're on this topic. It just seems to me that every commune I've ever seen started because somebody donated it, like their private property started it off, right? It always started with some form of private property that somebody opened up to the commons, and then it always seems that it fades away within 20 or 100 years or something like that. It's like, oh, they had this run, and then the commune failed, right? I mean, it just couldn't.
I suppose the clearest counter example, in a sense, to its fading away would be the family. That families often, depends on the family, but my wife and I do not, in any serious sense, maintain separate private property, so that we as a couple are a commune. Our children are a little bit less so, but to a considerable extent that's true as well. We don't charge them for dinner. And that form of institution has existed for very long periods of time, but it's a very, very small commune, and problems become much less when you're talking about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people than when you're talking about thousands of them. I'm not sure if there are any examples, that is, monasteries are the case that occurs to me, where you've got something that's in some sense a commune that's been stable for long periods of time. And certainly monasteries have lasted for much more than 100 years, individual monasteries. So I'm not sure you're right, your result is right in general. I would have said that communes require some sort of common belief, common set of objectives that make people willing to sacrifice a good deal to work together. But that could be a strongly held religious belief. It could be, the love that husband and wife and kids have for each other. It could be following a charismatic leader, which is how a number of modern communes come into existence. And often that fades over time. In particular, charismatic leaders get old and die if nothing else happens to them. In the case of the Oneida commune, by the way, I don't know if you history, it's sort of intriguing history, but the original founder pulls out of it when he's fairly old. It's collapsing. You have a bunch of elderly people who spent all of their life in this commune and therefore don't have individual savings. One of the sons of the founder turns the Oneida commune into a private corporation making silverware, which still exists. That's where your Oneida silverware comes from.
Oh, really?
And used that to support essentially the, as it were, retired commune members successfully. So it's sort of an interesting case of a smooth transition from a commune to a private firm, which was managed, as far as I can tell, successfully, and it's still in business. And I'm not sure how many people realize when they buy Oneida silverware that this is the descendant of this outrageous, immoral group, 19th century group family, which presumably would offend all of the principles of people on the left and people on the right in different ways, and yet, existed for one generation and functioned tolerably well.
Yeah, fair enough. Specifically, what private organizations, movements, or individuals do you believe people should fund more or support or join or listen to, and which one do you think deserve less attention?
Yeah, that's the first point, is that the answer is not the same for everybody. That one of the patterns you observe in political movements is they spend a whole lot of effort on infighting, on attacking each other. And part of what drives that infighting, part of the reason you spend energy on infighting, is that it's more fun arguing with somebody who agrees that between you you've got the secret to the world than arguing with somebody who thinks you're a nut. So in that sense, if you're a socialist, you may find arguing with other socialists more interesting than arguing with non-socialists, and similarly for libertarians. But the other thing that's going on is the idea that your movement has a fixed pool of resources, the volunteer labor of the members, for example. And if I persuade them to do the wrong thing, that's diverting energy from the right thing that you want to persuade them to do. And that's one of the things I think that fuels the infighting. And I think it's a mistake, and it's a mistake that should be obvious to libertarians, that there isn't a right way of bringing liberty. I have a particular set of talents and interests and assets and resources. Given those, there are things that I would be good at doing, other things I wouldn't be good at doing. I have no particular interest in organizing political campaigns. And if you somehow persuade me that the only useful thing to do is organize political campaigns, the result is not that my time and energy will be available for doing that, but that I'll go read science fiction instead, or play World of Warcraft, or do something other than politicking. So it seems to me that each person has to say, given my interests and abilities, what are the things I would enjoy doing and be good at that will help bring liberty? And those are going to be different things for different people. So that I would say that, what the Libertarian Party would be useful, because that running candidates is not likely to achieve much in terms of winning elections, but it achieves something in terms of getting publicity for ideas. And if you get a significant number of votes, it puts some pressure on the major parties to try to steal the most popular ideas you're putting out in order that they can get those votes. So that's a useful activity. It's not an activity I engage in. It's not something I enjoy or would be good at. Writing fiction, which embeds the ideas in a fictional context, is a useful way of changing people's ideas. And I think both Ayn Rand and Robert Heinlein did spectacular jobs in that direction, as did George Bernard Shaw in the other direction. He was on the wrong side, but he is an example of a way in which writing, and lots of other people, of course, in which fiction can change ideas. So for some people, that's the appropriate path to follow. They'll probably do a better job if they don't think of their fiction as an attempt to persuade people. If they think of it as telling a story, which is what my fiction tries to do, but that story is naturally going to embed their worldview, and that will convey at least some of their ideas, one hopes. So that's a possible strategy. Starting firms is another strategy. That starting FedEx and UPS undermined the belief that you needed a government postal monopoly. That it's a lot more plausible to say, well, if the post office happened, that's all right, once you see that there are other firms providing essentially the same service privately. Similarly, working for school vouchers. It seems to me as a useful activity that a voucher system is not a full-blown libertarian free market system, but shifting from a system where the government both pays for schooling and runs it to one in which they pay for it but don't run it, it seems to me is a very large step in the right direction. And in the long run, one result of that is going to be a world where most schools are private, and in that world the argument for government involvement becomes weaker and weaker. So that's a possible strategy. So there isn't one right answer. What I do is to try to work out ideas and publicize those ideas and give talks about them. I also write fiction, although that's not mainly for political purposes. And other people do other things, and each person has to find his interest. In terms of organizations, I can say the only libertarian organization that I routinely contribute to is the Institute for Justice, IJ. They're a libertarian public interest law firm, and they litigate things like the Kelo case, for example, which they unfortunately lost, but some other cases they've won. And it seems to me that that's a very useful activity, trying within the existing legal system to, as best you can, work against oppressive laws. So I see them as good people. And I guess I contributed, in the last presidential election, I contributed money to the Libertarian Party candidate, because as far as I could tell, he was actually a libertarian as well as a more attractive candidate than the LP usually gets. The election before that, the Libertarian Party presidential candidate was not, as far as I could tell, a libertarian, and I neither contributed to nor voted for him. So again, it'll depend on the context. I had a conversation, actually, I don't know, maybe a year or two, maybe longer than that ago, with a very wealthy libertarian on the question of how can you spend money to promote liberty. And it's not a trivial problem. It's not entirely obvious to what extent giving money for causes helps or hurts. That one of the problems that concerns me less in that context than in context when you have political power is what I think of as the rice Christian problem. Rice Christians were Chinese who converted to Christianity because the missionaries had rice. And if you think for the moment the equivalent of rice Christians would be academics who support, say, an economist who argues in favor of the minimum wage law because he believes he can get funding by doing that. I'm not sure that would work in that particular case. But if you think of any case where there's some position that's popular with people who have a lot of resources to give out, one result is to corrupt the intellectual movement that they're supporting. Because it means when you're out of power, the only people who support your position are the ones who believe in it. When you're in power, you also get support from lots of people who don't believe in it. And I think I've sometimes suggested, not entirely seriously, that you have a sort of a political cycle, that you have some movement in power, and the result of this being in power is that the intellectual support for it gets worse and worse. And meanwhile, the people who are opposing it, there may not be many of them, but they're really good, because they have lots of opportunities to argue with people who disagree with them, because everyone disagrees with them. They're only people who really believe in what they're saying, and they've got to be pretty smart in order to maintain themselves in a hostile environment. So eventually their ideas become more and more powerful, and they eventually take over. And now the cycle reverses. And it's a oversimplified picture of the history of music. Think about the rise of left-wing ideas as partly reflecting the fact that in the U.S. in the 20s, they were the ones out of power, as it were. And the rise of libertarian ideas is partly reflecting the fact that in the U.S. in recent decades, we're mostly the ones who are out of power. So I don't want to claim it as a grand theory of political cycles, but it's sort of an interesting way of looking at it. But that raises a problem, because it means that if you're donating money to libertarian causes, you've got to figure out how to do it in a way that will encourage those causes rather than encourage people to
fight against you,
adopt your position without believing in it.
Yeah,
and those people may do bad things.
Hey, good stuff. We got to head out. As always, it's a pleasure having you here on the show. I want to thank all the viewers. First, I want you to give out your websites, any places that you want to push people to while you got their attention.
My website is www.daviddfriedman.com. At the top, one of the things at the top of that is a link to my blog, which is called Ideas, and which is not just about libertarianism. It's about whatever I feel like talking about at the moment. I've actually been thinking up a blog post about how to do Star Wars swords as a workable form of buffers with computer assistance. I may put that up or may not, but it's whatever I'm thinking about, which covers a lot of things. I've had a lot of posts recently on global warming issues, which I find interesting. I've had posts on unschooling. I've had posts on almost everything. At the top of my webpage, you will also find a link to the PDF of the second edition of my book, Machinery of Freedom. I expect to have a third edition out as a Kindle sometime pretty soon. It's basically written, so we're very near the publication point. You will also find on my webpage links to a number of my books, fully readable online, and to most of my published articles and essays. You will find links to videos and audio recordings of many of my talks, so that the web page really gives you a hub from which, if you're interested in my ideas, you can get exposed to quite a lot of them. You can also find a lot of medieval recipes, that one of my hobbies being cooking from very early cookbooks. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. And I want to thank all the viewers out there who sent in their questions prior to and during the show. I do appreciate you guys checking in and filling us up with such great inquiries. We obviously need these every single week for our Monday, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time special guest series that we have going on. Now, don't forget to check in tomorrow night, Tuesday, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Anarchy versus Minarchy. I'm moderating the debate between Victor Pross and Wayne Simmons. It's going to be huge. Hundreds of people already signed up to go, so can't wait for that. Thank you guys for all the support, and make sure you guys check out the Voluntary Virtues Network every single day. We start up our full launch in July, so we're really excited and hope to see many of you guys in PortFest. Till later in, I'll talk to you soon, and I want to thank David once again for being on the show. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.